Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. From Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and the palatial FYC studios, you're listening to For Your Consideration,
the podcast featuring roundtable discussions reevaluating the cinematic canon of past masterpieces and modern classics. I'm your host, Dustin Friesenan.
And I'm Mike Josick, and we'd like to give a shout out to anybody catching the show on iHeartRadio, Stitcher, YouTube, Google Play, and if you happen to stream or download the show off of iTunes, while you're there, we would love it if you took a few seconds to rate and review the show. It goes a long way to helping get the podcast into the eyes and ears of people who may be interested, but don't know we exist. If you're a regular listener to the podcast, welcome back. If this is your first time, beware, be warned, spoilers ahead. So as we discussed on our last episode, on this episode of the podcast, we are going to be doing one of Dustin's picks. He said he was in something of a Lars von Trier mood, if I'm not mistaken.
Mostly just I wanted to see his newest film, The House That Jack Built, uncut, but that doesn't exist for me right now since I'm not in the know, I guess.
Right now, the word uncut, after watching this movie, has all kinds of meanings. And since Dustin couldn't get his eyeballs into The House That Jack Built, he instead chose Antichrist.
AKA that film that shows you what somebody suffering from severe depression considers a fun exercise.
That was something Lars von Trier actually said in an interview, was it not?
That trying to get out of his depression, he wanted to see if he could do a film again. He wasn't sure he ever could, and that this was a fun exercise as a way to sort of work through it.
I love the fact that he threw the word fun in there.
I believe the quote that I read had fun in quotation marks, so I don't know who added those quotation marks, if it was Lars or the interviewer, or if somebody was just being a smarmy douche.
So it could have been said ironically. Fair enough. And as I've taken to doing on the show, whenever we watch one of these movies, I like to just throw out what format, what media we watched it on. And this time around, we checked it out on the Criterion Blu-ray release, which came out in November of 2010. The disc includes video interviews with von Trier and the actors, Willem Dafoe and Charlotte Gainsbourg, an audio commentary, which I have yet to hear, some making-of featurettes, and of course the usual booklet featuring an essay by film scholar Ian Christie. It's your usual Criterion kind of release. Rarely do they disappoint. So if you are interested in the film, or if you're curious to check out the film after listening to this and you enjoy it, go get it. Go check it out. So let's do the credits so we can talk about this movie, and I believe talk we shall. Antichrist was directed by Lars von Trier. It was produced by Mette Louise Foldager. It was written by Lars von Trier, starred Willem Dafoe and Charlotte Gainsbourg. Music was by Christian Eitnes Andersen. Cinematography was by Anthony Dodmantle. It was edited by Anders Refn and Asa Mossberg. Produced by a bevy of production companies. Distributed by Nordisk Film Distribution. And it was released on the 20th of May 2009 in Denmark and the 10th of September 2009 in Germany. That's a day after my birthday. The film, like any von Trier film, was
polarizing, you say?
Polarizing. It was received by some critics very favorably, by some critics not so favorably. Divisive as usual.
Anywhere from perfect to garbage.
But it did win the Robert Award for Best Danish Film, the Nordic Council Film Prize for Best Nordic Film, and the European Film for Best Cinematography.
And it managed to make it onto the BFI's top films of all time as 894th on the critics poll.
Meaning one critic voted for it?
Meaning tied with so many films that we do on this show.
So this was my first time watching the film, but I believe Dustin has seen it prior to this. So, Dustin, as usual, you will start off with the conversation. What did you think watching Antichrist again?
The first time I watched it, I had no idea what I was getting into. I don't think I looked up any synopses or reviews, so...
Sometimes that's the best way to experience a movie.
Often I would agree. But in this case, I know that I didn't quite get all I could out of the film, which is why immediately after I saw it the first time, I knew I'd want to see it again just to see what the heck it was that I just watched.
I'm curious if I can just digress briefly. If you knew nothing about the movie, what was it that originally got you to check it out?
I think I might have had it recommended to me by my younger brother.
Okay.
Whose film tastes are questionable at best. I could be completely mistaken, though. He sometimes just watches stuff that's supposed to be real gory or sketchy, this, that, the other. Like, he recommended to me Seed by Uwe Ball, which was pure garbage. It's what happens if you try to make a torture slasher flick and you're Uwe Ball. It was bad and dumb. But he was super impressed by it. At the same time, I think it was him who recommended Martyrs to me. So, it's he runs the gamut. You have to take everything with a full bucket of salt. Just toss that whole fucker over your shoulder.
So he's the kind of person that if he was listening to your In Case You Were Considering show, he'd probably be angry because you're saying those movies are shit.
He's the kind of guy who might legitimately enjoy August Underground for sure, but I think he'd also really dislike some of the other ones for similar reasons. But going into it this time, coming out of it this time, I don't know where I'm going to land. Normally I know where I'm going to land at the end of a film, but here I'm not too sure. For the first half or 75% of the film, it really feels like not much is going on. It feels very schizophrenic. Sometimes it feels super ham-fisted because you're getting like these statues talking about grief, pain, and despair, and it's like that's a little ham-fisted here when that's what she's talking about. And Willem Dafoe plays sort of the psychologist husband, and one thing I noticed this time very early on is that they both seemed like very archetypal stereotypes for men and women. She was overly emotional, reacted almost absurdly in a number of situations, shouting at him and then going back on stuff and forgetting what she said. And it happens throughout the film, whereas he is very detached and he knows everything.
Super rational.
Super rational. You can't tell him anything because he knows best for everybody at all times. So it felt like very stereotypes to me, which made sense by the end of it. Pretty much what I have to say about the film is you got to look at the individual pieces that are thrown at you. One, you've got nature is the devil's church. That was supposed to be a big thing apparently when he originally wrote it, that Satan created Earth, but that was sort of spoiled by some other screenwriter, and so he had to rewrite it. But she does mention it, that nature is Satan's church, and he writes it in his little pyramid of her fears, Satan and nature, like right up there near the top.
I wonder how that would have played into it if that was the end. We can maybe touch on that when we talk about the end a little bit more later, but I just want to put a pin in that right now because you did mention that while we were watching the movie, and so I thought to myself, okay, well, I'm going to watch the end and I'm going to see sort of how I feel, how that would kind of fold into it. And at the moment, we talked briefly between ending the movie and starting the recording, like I kind of have my interpretation of the film, and I have no idea how that concept
would fit in.
So I'm curious to get back to that. But you were saying nature is Satan's church?
Yeah, nature is Satan's church. And at one point, Willem Dafoe does some really terrible role play as a psychologist, where he's like, I am nature. All right, what do you want, nature? I'm here to hurt you. And then he says, oh no, I'm not like nature. I'm the nature of mankind. And she's like, oh, that's what you're talking about. Okay, I gotcha.
What did I say to you when that scene played?
I actually can't remember.
That was the moment the movie lost me.
Oh, there you go. That's where it lost you. And funny enough, that's almost where it started to pick me up, because I started getting a bit more metaphysical with it, and I think you're a bit more grounded in your interpretation.
Well, I think it was just, like you said, the first 75% of the movie sort of felt like it was going nowhere, but I mean, having watched 3 or 4 hours of Nymphomaniac, I kind of feel like that's just the kind of storytelling that Lars von Trier engages in. I mean, I went into this movie very clearly, very early, thinking, it was about grief, pain, and despair, and I thought it was going to be a story that played out between a couple and how they deal with it, and I figured it would probably have some wonkiness to it because this is Lars von Trier. Ultimately, even as more sort of metaphysical elements got added to it, it would still remain grounded in these performances by Charlotte Gainsbourg and Willem Dafoe, and that it would explore these ideas and how they're affecting these people after the death of their child. And when they started doing the role-playing, there was a slow little bit kind of before that where I started going, I'm not really sure he's sort of being consistent with the logic that he's created in this world and with this story. And they started...
This film about mental illness is very schizophrenic. You look at some of the cuts. Some of the cuts I remember seeing, like, she's looking one direction, there's a cut, she looks to another. There's weird little short time skips between these cuts. The angle goes all sorts of wonky.
Did you notice the distortion?
I did notice the distortion. I was going to mention that, actually. I wonder what kind of lens he's using for some of these.
Oh, I think that was a digital distortion. That was probably done in post.
But yeah, there's a very... He gets the sense of mental illness and depression and anxiety very, very well done. The score, as it's going through the first half of the film before she's cured, as she declares at one point, like, the score is very in your face and very distorted, very creepy. And I was very much digging it. I actually noticed it a fair bit, and then it just disappears, and everything is calm again. And it's during that time that you see the first two beggars, as it is. Pain and Despair, I believe.
The second of which being my favorite.
The wolf is there's a fox eating its own stomach, and it declares chaos reigns.
When that fox in slow motion goes, chaos reigns, I was like... This just saved the movie for me. Because it was so bonkers.
Absolutely bonkers. Actually, one thing I loved was your reaction to a few things. There was that. There was the hardcore penetrative sex at the beginning. There was the log to the groin.
Well, I actually wasn't that shocked by the hardcore penetrative sex at the beginning because, as I said, I've seen Nymphomaniac. And I know that Von Trier...
But it was one of the few things that had a reaction from you. Like, oh, okay, this is what I'm watching now.
Yeah, I honestly, I haven't seen a lot of Von Trier films, so I kind of thought that Nymphomaniac is where he really sort of explored that. But clearly this is something that he'd done previously, and Nymphomaniac was just sort of the culmination, I guess. But it kind of caught my attention because for a second, the way it was cut and the way it was shot, I really wasn't sure if they were using porn actor doubles for Dafoe and Gainsbourg, or whether Dafoe and Gainsbourg were actually copulating, which is always a question in movies by Von Trier and by Gaspar Noé. In the case of Noé, they are having sex. That's kind of his thing. But yeah, I think that was less... I mean, you might have read it more as shock, but that was just more of me kind of like... honestly being taken out of the movie and thinking of the film on a more technical level.
But it was still a reaction, and that's pretty much what it was for me. I like to see people's reactions. That I always find interesting.
But yeah, the log to the groin.
Oh, jeez.
And then the bloody orgasm.
The clitorectomy.
There was a few things. Even the fox eating its stomach. When she clubs him over the head. When he's standing there in that...
Because it comes out of the blue, and she runs in there like a maniac. It's ridiculous.
He's having this quiet moment, like reading the autopsy report, and then... Wah!
Boom! You're gonna leave me! What? And that's one of those stereotypical sort of female things. Just weird, violent reaction that...
Emphasis on the stereotypical.
Oh, 100% emphasis on the stereotypical. These are
Very
exaggerated
tropey
characters, super tropey, and it, especially with the fact that she was writing this book when she first went out to Eden, which is your first.
It was like her PhD thesis or something.
Yeah,
or...
her thesis, which is on gynocide, which for those of you who are like me and weren't in the know until I looked it up, is the attacks or murders, violence against women simply because they are women. And at one point, he's talking to her about her thesis, and she says effectively that while doing this research, she grew to believe that women deserved it. And he's like, what in the hell are you talking about? Your thesis is the opposite of that. You should be questioning this shit. And she's like, well, I didn't mean it. I don't know why I said that. I'm just going to stop talking now. So basically, I want to end this conversation. You're not actually changing what I'm believing. I accidentally told you the truth, so I'm just going to stop talking about it.
I'm actually really impressed that you managed to bring it back to the role play. Because that was the conversation they had during the role play. Because she was talking about how she was researching how women were considered evil and killed for essentially being women, and how she had recontextualized herself as being evil or revealed that during the role play. And I think that's a really pivotal thing in the film.
I would agree. Because as I said, you have nature being devil's church. You have the whole thing with nature being human nature. And now all of a sudden she's talking about gynocide, which it all starts here in Eden, where Willem Dafoe's character also finds out that she'd been potentially torturing their kid.
Abusing the kid by putting his shoes on wrong and deforming his feet.
The autopsy report found that his feet were slightly deformed, yeah, and he saw these pictures where his shoes were on wrong, and they were all out here in Eden. So what it almost seems like to me is that being out in Eden, in nature, somehow this evil affected her, where she became that evil woman that she was researching, and thus making it sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where she becomes evil, more and more evil, until the man has to kill her for her being sinful, for her having abused the kid, for her having ignored the kid when they were having sex at the beginning and watching him fall out the window, for drilling a whetstone into his leg and trying to bury him alive like a crazy person. And all of that could be influence from nature, because you have the representatives of nature, the three beggars, who when they appear, someone has to die, and they sat down by her. It's as though human nature is to commit gynocide, to hate women, to torture women.
I kind of like where you ended up at the end there. And I agree with what you said about sort of the sequence of events as they led up to sort of the climactic finale. I do think there's another layer there, because I don't just think it's using the iconography and having these characters play out a role, kind of like Aronofsky had Javier Bardem and Jennifer Lawrence in Mother, be their representations and sort of play out kind of a story. I think there's also some subtext there, because, or rather not subtext, I think there's also a character motivation there, in the sense that they show that flashback of her while making love to Willem Dafoe. I think this movie needs just a quick recap. Just to contextualize sort of when we're talking about elements of the movie, so people can maybe just know what the sequence of events are. The movie starts with Willem Dafoe and Charlotte Gainsbourg. They're a couple, married couple. They are having very passionate sex. Their child, who is in the crib, hops out of the crib, opens the baby gate, crawls up on a ledge, falls out a window, dies. There's a funeral. She goes into
severe depression. Blames herself because she knew about his wandering escapades, so all the blame was put on the woman at that point.
He's a therapist. He tries to help her. He's like, nobody knows you better than I do, and I love you, and I want to help you through this. Grief is a natural process. It is not a disease. So he's trying to find out what she's afraid of, because he wants her to confront her fear. She says she's afraid of Eden, which is this forest where they have a cabin. So in order to conquer that fear, they end up going to this cabin where things go a little crazy.
He finds her work. He finds the connection between the foot deformity and how she was treating him. She attacks him, accusing him of wanting to leave her, beats him unconscious before drilling a hole in his leg and attaching a whetstone, at which point he tries to crawl into a foxhole to get away from her. She buries him alive, regrets her actions, apparently forgot what she did, and everyone seems to ignore it for a little bit, brings him back to the cabin where
the three beggars show up, which is a fox, a raven, and a deer.
All of which who have appeared in the film prior. The deer as he was approaching the cabin, as well as the fox. The deer having a stillborn fawn hanging out of it. The fox was eating itself alive. And the crow was pretty much dead in the foxhole and told her where he was. Pretty much revealed his position. He tried to kill it, but it would not die. And it also revealed where the wrench was by cawing underneath the cabin where she had tossed it, thus allowing him to escape. Afterwards, they all appeared when she was knocked out or just laying there and sat down by her. She had said prior that when the three beggars appear, someone has to die, and at that point, after having fought a little bit, he strangles her to death and wanders off, where you see the bodies of hundreds of women appear out of the ground.
Faceless.
Well, before, while he was wandering, you could see an aerial shot where just the women were just laying there on the ground, and then afterwards, all those a bunch of women whose faces were distorted all approach him, and that's how it ends.
Yeah. So that's the general sort of chronology of the story. What I was trying to say was that I think for the character of she, their names are he and she.
Because people do not use each other's names all the time in conversation. It's one of the things that I loved about this film the first time I saw it, and I love it still.
I think there's something about her that didn't enjoy being a mother. Maybe it was something that interfered with her schooling or her career, or maybe she suffered from mental illness, and all of this stuff just compounded. Her husband was distant. Maybe she resented her child. And there's a flashback later in the film where while they're having sex at the beginning and the kid goes out the window, she's looking over and she sees the kid and she lets it happen. And there's a lot of violent sex that happens in this movie where she's having anxiety attacks and she's really distraught and emotional and manic, and she has really violent sex with her therapist husband. And there's times at the cabin where she's like, I want you to hit me. I want you to hit me really hard. I think she feels
him afterwards when he doesn't. Like, you don't love me if you won't hit me, sort of deal.
I think she was a woman who, through her mental illness, resented her child, and through her inaction allowed her child to die. Over the course of the film, she's punishing herself for that. She hates herself for that. And I think it was when they were at the cabin the previous year with the kid, when she was putting the shoes on backwards and stuff. That whole thing about nature is Satan's church. And this is where I think she started really resenting the kid, and she's doing all the research on the gynocide and women being evil. And I think she internalized that. She thought, I hate my child, and here's all of this information that I'm reading and studying and researching that is basically saying that women are evil. By coming back, that just sort of wakes everything up. And I think that's why she goes into these fugue-like episodes where she puts the whetstone on him and throws the wrench under the stoop and completely forgets that that's where it is.
And a lot of that could have been predicated from, as she was saying in the beginning, that he's very distant. The only time he finally cares about her is now that she's his patient.
Yeah.
Until then, like, whoop-de-frickin' do. So while she was having sex with him, she might have been like, well, he's wandering around, but he's finally paying attention to me, so I don't care. And she even mentions how she wanted him at the cabin, and he's like, well, you said you didn't want me there. I assumed that you wanted sort of peace and quiet, you and Nick. No, that's not what I wanted. It's what I said, but it wasn't what I wanted, which is another one of those extremely stereotypical things of the archetypal male and female, which I sort of notice, and I that's where I feel it's a bit schizophrenic in how it's portraying things. There is an underlying tone that could very easily be represented as misogyny in here, because if it is human nature to commit violence against women, then the human nature that she was perpetrating is that women are evil.
Not that the film is misogynistic, but that the film represents misogyny.
And that's where I wonder, where's that line? Which side of that line is it on? Was it done clever enough that it's on?
See, I never felt that von Trier crossed that line into the I hate women or this is what women are, and I kind of felt like this was holding a mirror up, right? Like I said, I think she hated herself. All of these things that are traditionally considered feminine, and you're supposed to love being a mother and all of this stuff. At one point in the film, she cuts off her own clitoris because that's where she derives sexual pleasure from, and she, sex was tied into the neglect of the child and the death of the child. She wants to die. I mean, I think
she shouted that at the beginning, and he said, "I'm not going to let you do that."
Yeah, and I don't think she's necessarily orchestrating it. I think there is like a force, there is a momentum. I can't think of the word. there's a center of gravity in this film that's pulling things towards it, so to speak, and I think that's ultimately where we come to at the end, where Willem Dafoe strangles her in the cabin.
At the behest of the three beggars, who he does see, just as he sees the women around him, the faceless women.
And, who knows if it's a literal thing, if he actually is there, if they're either, in the cabin, or if this is just a representation of attitudes or themes or ideas. Who knows if these supernatural metaphysical elements actually exist and are there. Maybe he does just kill her and then leave. That's kind of up to the viewer to decide. I think the movie is just presenting these ideas in such a way to have an impact and to make you think about them and sort through them in your head and kind of figure out what it is, and simultaneously representing what it's like to suffer from mental illness. Because like you said, some of the editing in the movie, it's very choppy. The eye lines are kind of weird. People who are conversing in one direction are suddenly conversing in another direction. It looks like some lines which are naturally kind of flowing. Like you don't feel like you've missed any of the dialogue, but there's a cut there.
And you feel like some time went by.
And there might have just been a pause, but because the camera is handheld, and Von Trier is doing a very live verite style of camera work.
Some of the zooms and the ups and downs actually reminds me very much of watching Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Where the camera would zoom in on something and be you can see the handheld version of it.
So when you do have one of those cuts between the dialogue, it's not like watching a YouTube video where your guy's just trying to make it punchier. It looks a lot more disjointed because the camera is in motion. But then there's these beautiful slow-mo bits, some amazing visual iconography, and moments where things are happening where you're not sure if they're actually happening or if it's happening in their heads. I mean, there's that moment where Willem Dafoe says grief is not a disease, but I kind of almost feel like that's maybe one of the ideas working in the film, because he does seem to get more and more
infected by it.
Air quote infected. Yeah, exactly. So I do think that this movie gives you some of the startling moments, some of the discomfort, some of the jitteriness and the schizophrenic kind of nature of what's going on, and the not necessarily knowing where you are exactly in the story, while still being a very linear sort of narrative. I think that's his attempt to kind of go, hey, this is what it feels to be in this pain and despair and grief.
And I do think that he captures it very well early on in the film, but later on it loses a lot of that side with the mental illness and seems to go a bit more supernatural. And you have your grounded psychological illness sort of story for it, but then I feel like they're very archetypal. There's a number of ways to interpret it, but I feel like there's too much going on. You've got some really ham-fisted stuff, some really, this is what's going on, these are the declarative statements of things that are happening. Your three beggars there as the child climbs up onto the table, knocks them over, falls off, and alright, so the beggars make a number of scenes. The chapters, because the movie is divided into chapters, are the names of the beggars until they finally get there and cause the end. I feel like there's too much happening, too many ways to interpret, that it's not cohesive enough. It is very schizophrenic.
Don't you think that feeds into the feeling of welcome to my mental illness, though?
To an extent, yes. But if it's an exercise in sort of dealing with your own mental illness, then are you not feeding...
I mean, there is a manic nature to the story, like you said. It does get exaggerated at the end, and it's very sedate at the beginning. It's a very quiet movie, and it gets progressively crazier.
And while you say quiet, it's actually much louder in the beginning soundtrack-wise, but very quiet in the action, and that does a complete flip by the end.
It's true.
The action is all over the place, but the soundtrack is nearly non-existent. And it ends with the same aria that you had at the beginning. And
I mean, the whole nature of, a manic mood swing, it's not called manic depression anymore. What is it called now?
Bipolar disorder?
No, it's not called bipolar either.
The name's changed so much.
It's all part of the spectrum. But when people used to talk about manic depressives, it wasn't just that they were depressed all the time. It was that you went from one extreme to the other. the pendulum would swing back and forth, and you could be in a depression for days, and you can be super manic and productive for days.
And some manic depressives had more of one than the other, and some had none of one and only the other.
So the fact that this movie sort of shifts from one extreme to the next, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but that may reflect some of that.
It very well could. But that's the thing. I think that there's too much that you could read into, sort of a let's throw a whole lot of stuff at the wall and see what sticks, and sort of let people interpret what they want. I can definitely see how it would be just an exercise in can I still make a film? And in doing so, it didn't have all the quality he might have otherwise. It sort of felt like he was just trying a whole lot of different things to me. And I could be reading into what I've read about the film outside of the film.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think you could be right just based on, what you told me, which was he was in a deep depression while making the film and would take time off and was very loose in his direction, and it was very kind of organic production in the way things would roll out, and the actors were really experimenting, and that knowing that now, I can totally see that reflected in the film. It's a very loose film with some incredibly focused and tight cinematography, which is kind of interesting. There's some amazing imagery in this movie. The branches and the arms and the trees with the shadows.
And most any slow motion scene, even though those also stopped near the end. The last one being Willem Dafoe as it rained acorns, one of his nightmares, because he started having nightmares too. And that's why you were saying the whole grief is not an illness thing might be a hint that grief is an illness in this film.
Or it could even be that von Trier just viewed grief as an illness. I know anytime I've experienced it...
Or not contagious, rather. I already forgot the quote.
No, he said grief is not a sickness. But there was a point where Willem Dafoe's character in the forest would start to see things. And I was asking you, because you had seen it before, and I was saying, is one of the themes in this movie that grief is a sickness? Is he catching the sickness?
And every question that you asked me, also down with the sickness is the first thing that came to my mind. Every time that you'd ask me one of these questions about themes or what he was going for, my response is always, I have no idea. I honestly have no idea. And watching it again this time, I can interpret it in like 3 or 4 different ways. That's why I'm sort of feeling like it was throw a bunch of stuff at the wall.
Weirdly, I kind of like that about this, though. And I feel that you really do have to make it to the end, because...
75% of the way through, you have nothing to work with.
I drifted at least twice where I was like, this movie's got to pull something pretty spectacular out of its ass to sort of get my my attention back.
And that's why I'm wondering where you're actually going to end at the end here, because it could still go either way for you.
Yeah, and like you, I went into this expecting to probably say masterpiece, and then as I was watching it, I was like, no, I doubt this is going to be a masterpiece. And then once the movie ended, I thought to myself, I don't know where I'm going to go. And then we talked about it for a bit, and then we talked about it during this, and I do actually have...
You have an answer?
I do have an answer.
And that is our segue into our Masterpiece Museum piece thing here.
Do you have an answer?
I'm going to let you say your answer first. I'm going to be rude like that.
Before we close out completely, I did want to mention the title Antichrist. We were trying to figure out why it's titled Antichrist. We were doing some reading online, and the actual Greek translation is opposed to Christ.
To which while watching the film, actually, I was sort of trying to figure out what would be the Antichrist in this film based solely off the title, and nature was what I came down with. And after hearing that explanation, I'm doubling down on it being nature. What would you say?
Like so many other things in the movie, I think it could apply to a lot of things. I think it could apply to Eden, as you said. I think it could apply to her looking at herself and the fact that she feels she is evil. She might feel that she is opposed to Christ, and it's what they believed the women in the 16th century that she was researching were kind of about. I did try and shoehorn some kind of interpretation for the kid to be the Antichrist Like maybe she viewed the child as the Antichrist, and maybe that's why she couldn't connect with him. Or maybe she viewed the husband as the Antichrist. I don't know.
And the last thing I'll throw out here is the theoretical idea of maybe she, talking about mental illness, just wanting to throw out Munchausen's by proxy, since she was injuring the kid and allowed the kid to fall out the window. Perhaps she wanted the attention that that kind of grief and those kind of injuries would have him give her, just as one of the other many things that are possible interpretations of what's going on here.
I do need to ask you, I mentioned Mother earlier in the conversation. Did you get some Mother vibes off of this?
Other than the fact that they're both films with many possible interpretations, not really.
The slow build to the craziness at the end, some of the camera work. Maybe it was just me.
I can see it from what you're saying, but it didn't have a Mother vibe to me.
Fair enough.
In spite of the religious imagery and...
See, marriage is also supposed to be like a covenant with God. And part of the point of marriage is to bring a child into the world. And so that's why I think that might also apply to the Antichrist.
Oh, fertility religions.
Breeder cults. We just lost all our Christian listeners right there.
Like Hosier says in Take Me to Church, they say worship in the bedroom, right?
All right, let us move into the judgment segment of the program.
Lest ye be judged.
Okay, Mr. Nature. What do you want?
To hurt you as much as I can.
So after much careful consideration, and I still can't 100% say I like this movie.
I can agree with you on that.
I'm going to say masterpiece. I'm going to say masterpiece because after thinking about it, after talking about it, there was a moment after watching the movie where I said, I think I have an interpretation. And even if it was wrong, even if it wasn't what von Trier intended, it felt valid. And I know that von Trier probably would have been perfectly happy that that was my valid interpretation. Like so much of this kind of surrealist, abstract kind of filmmaking, that's what the filmmaker kind of ultimately wants anyways. They're hoping that you get what they say, but they're also happy that you're pulling something out of it. And the fact that, we're talking about it and I'm discovering kind of more about it from what you saw, and the fact that what I thought about it does dovetail kind of nicely with what you thought about it. It is a beautiful movie to look at. It is technically proficient. And I think he achieved what he set out to do, and I think the movie succeeds in what it is. And it's very provocative, even though I'm honestly sick of seeing Charlotte Gainsbourg naked. I think Charlotte Gainsbourg is a beautiful woman. It's just one of those things where you just get weirdly desensitized, and it's almost like...
Especially the violent situations that they're sort of in. After you see somebody give themselves a clitorectomy, it's...
Yeah. So yeah, I'm going to fall with masterpiece, and I'm curious where you're going to fall.
I thought it might have been a bit more obvious with all my talking about how it seems like it's a shotgun spray of ideas against the wall. And although his sort of schizophrenic camera work and a number of the scenes could be entirely intentional, I feel that with all of the discordant ideas that you have to work with, it's a bit much. It's a little bit too much. It's something that's definitely worth talking about, and 100% you'll get a lot of discussion out of a film like Antichrist. Probably a lot of his other films. I don't know. I actually don't think I've seen any other Lars von Trier movies. But that's sort of what puts it in museum piece for me. It's not something that I'd hold up as being a pinnacle of the art house kind of film, but it's definitely something worth looking at and examining. Whether or not it's great or not, it is worth looking at. It's worth checking out for anyone who's interested in these kind of films. But I think that it could have been done so much better. Could be a bit more cohesive in what it was going for. So I'm a museum piece, obviously, after having said that a few times.
The thing I find the most hilarious about this is that I also completely agree with you. I can totally see where and why you would fall on that side of the fence, and your reasons are completely valid.
Effectively, our rating systems are different. Sort of like between different colleges. You get 80%, and is that an A in one place and a B in another? That is where we're lying here. We're at just the difference in how we grade.
I guess we can just agree to disagree.
So that's what we thought of Antichrist. We would love to know what you guys think, either of our thoughts, our conversation, or the film itself. You can find us on Facebook, search For Your Consideration. We are on Twitter at FYC Show. We are on Instagram, I believe also FYC Show. We have a blog, fycshow.wordpress.com. You can email us at fycshowmail@gmail.com. And there's always the YouTube comment wall. The very popular, very busy YouTube comment wall. That seems to be where we get most of our comments. As we said at the top of the show, if you like what you hear, if you can hit the social medias, subscribe, like, follow, share wherever you can. Word of mouth, it's a powerful tool. And if you want to support the show in a slightly more robust way, we do have the Patreon campaign, patreon.com/FYC Show. We've got some reward levels. Give what you can, helps us keep the lights on, helps us just kind of keep things going.
I feel with his constant repetition, he's really trying to tell me to change the light bulbs in this place. Given that I have subjected you to this film, which I think you weren't too excited to see initially, what film do you have for me that I won't be too excited to see initially?
You know what? I've been talking about Steven Soderbergh's remake of Solaris for a while.
You have been.
And I think I'm going to throw that out as the next movie that we cover.
Well, there's another film that I have no idea what it's about.
Barring one of our guests who wants to do Velvet Goldmine.
Barring a potential guest who wants to do something.
A guest coming on will always trump whatever it is we're doing.
Because it is so hard to line this stuff up.
We've been talking with a number of people, and it's just a matter of scheduling and timing.
It's hard enough for us to get together, and we live together, ostensibly. I haven't seen you in 2 weeks.
But yeah, it's a bit of a struggle, but we love having guests, and we hope that you guys enjoy having a third point of view when talking about the movies. So anytime we can, we'll go that route instead. But if that doesn't happen, we're going to plan on Solaris. So thanks again so much for checking out the show. We appreciate your patronage, your comments, your presence, your downloads,
your views, your likes, your dislikes. We crave any and all attention.
Be sure to join us next time on the podcast. And until then, I've been your host, Mike.
And I've been Dustin.
Take care.
Peace.
Sorry. I hope
none of that floats over here.